In the last years of the 15th century, a young princess stood at the heart of a diplomatic revolution. Her name was Joanna, third child of the legendary Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. She was not born to rule. Her destiny, like that of so many royal daughters, was to be a bride, a living treaty sent across the mountains and seas to seal an alliance. The ink on the contract bound her to Philip, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, Archduke of Burgundy, a young man known to history as Philip the Handsome. When Joanna's ship finally anchored on the wild Flemish coast in the autumn of 1496, she carried with her the heavy piety of Spain, the fierce intellect of her mother, and a heart entirely unprepared for what she would find. The court of Burgundy was a world away from the austere, devotional atmosphere of Castile. Here, life was a tapestry of tournaments, feasting, and an almost theatrical cult of courtly love. When Joanna first laid eyes on Philip, the formal alliance erupted into something far more volatile and human. He was everything his nickname promised: athletic, golden-haired, radiating a magnetic charm that made the Spanish princess forget every shred of diplomatic caution. The attraction was instant, a thunderclap of mutual desire. The priest who was supposed to marry them the next day was summoned immediately, so urgent was their passion. They were wed that very night, a spontaneous act that whispered of a love story for the ages. In those early months, Joanna was consumed. She was the enamored wife, the center of a whirlwind of physical passion that shocked the Burgundian courtiers and deeply worried the chaperones sent from Spain. Her confessor wrote to Queen Isabella, bewildered, that the princess showed an excessive love for her husband. This was not the measured, dynastic affection expected of a queen-in-waiting. It was a raw, possessive, all-consuming fire. But fire does not burn alone without consuming what feeds it. Philip, a creature of political expediency and voracious appetites, quickly grew weary of a wife whose devotion felt more like a chain. For Joanna, love was a monogamous sanctuary. For Philip, it was a conquest that, once secured, merely cleared the ground for the next hunt. His infidelities began almost immediately, barely disguised, a parade of ladies-in-waiting and noblewomen who became his temporary favorites. And it was here, in the chasm between Joanna's sacred notion of marriage and Philip's casual transgressions, that the legend of her madness began to take its first dark shape. She did not simply weep in private. She raged. She confronted his mistresses, at one point famously attacking a woman she believed was a rival with a pair of scissors, ordering that her famously beautiful golden hair be shorn off. These were not the actions of a queen in a political marriage turning a blind eye. These were the raw, bleeding wounds of a soul in romantic agony. The court, which at first had been amused by her Spanish formality, now whispered. They saw a foreign woman, isolated by language, humiliated by her husband, and ruled by emotions that no decent aristocrat would ever display so publicly. In their eyes, her jealous fury was not righteous anger but a sickness of the mind, a flaw in her blood. Then death, a cold and implacable architect, began to redraw the map of Joanna's world. In a cascade of tragedy, her older brother John died, then her older sister Isabella, the Queen of Portugal, and then Isabella's infant son. Joanna, the third child, the one who was never meant to matter, suddenly found herself the heiress to the united crowns of Castile and Aragon. Politics, which had once been a distant abstract, now invaded her bedroom. Philip, who had treated her heart with such carelessness, looked at her belly with entirely new, calculating eyes. She was carrying his children, and through her he could reach for a throne. The French king and her own father, Ferdinand, began circling, seeing an opportunity to seize power should she be declared incompetent. It was at this moment that Philip and Ferdinand discovered a terrible, shared interest. They both had a political need for Joanna to be considered insane. A mad queen cannot rule. A mad queen needs a regent. Her passionate temperament, her depressive withdrawal, her fainting spells, which may have been a mix of epilepsy, melancholia, or simply the overwhelming pressure of a life she could not control, were all weaponized against her. The men in her life, her husband and her father, became her jailers under the guise of being her protectors. The psychological crucible reached its peak during a return voyage to Spain. The ship was caught in a ferocious storm, and while the crew and nobles cried out in terror and prayed for salvation, Joanna displayed a chilling, stoic calm. It was not the peace of faith, but the indifference of a person who had already lost everything that mattered. She was heard to remark that she was no longer afraid of dying, for her only fear had been to die without her husband, and now he was by her side. The storm passed, but a new, more insidious tempest awaited her on dry land. Back in Castile, the conflict between Philip and Ferdinand for control of her power and her very body became an open war. After a tense meeting, her father, seeing he could not win against Philip's Flemish troops and Castilian allies, signed a secret treaty with his son-in-law, jointly declaring Joanna unfit to govern. The document stated that her infirmities and sufferings prevented her from exercising power. Her own father signed her mind away. Philip's victory was total, but brutally short. In September 1506, after drinking cold water while overheated from a game of pelota, the 28-year-old Archduke and king consort fell violently ill with a fever. Within days, the handsome, athletic, golden prince was dead. And it is here, at the moment when the world expected Joanna's madness to completely eclipse her, that her story transforms into something far stranger, far darker, and far more defiant than any simple tale of jealous hysteria. It becomes the legend of the Queen and the Coffin. Joanna's grief was not a quiet, veiled sorrow. It was a monumental, terrifying, and deeply physical performance of refusal. She would not allow Philip's body to be interred in the royal chapel in Granada, the resting place of the monarchs, as if burial would finally and irrevocably steal him from her. Instead, she ordered that his embalmed body, sealed in a lead coffin, would travel with her across the kingdom of Castile. This was not a quick, direct funeral procession. It was a wandering. The journey began in Burgos, under the autumn rains, and it snaked through the heart of Castile, covering hundreds of miles at a pace that can only be described as ghostly. Joanna, heavily pregnant with her sixth child, insisted on traveling only at night. She called her procession the Torchlight Cortege, a flickering serpent of mourners, soldiers, monks, and nobles winding through the dark, empty plains. When asked why she avoided the day, her answer was a dagger of logic from a supposedly broken mind. A widow who has lost the son of her soul should avoid the light of day. The rituals she performed around the coffin only deepened the whispers of witchcraft and lunacy. The casket was never to be opened in the presence of any woman, a testament to her pathological jealousy that even death could not cure. She stationed an armed guard around it constantly. At every stop, in convents and monasteries, the coffin would be opened, and she would check to ensure his body was still there, touching his feet to reassure herself of his solidity. She had been betrayed so often by the living Philip that she could not trust the dead one to stay. The most infamous moment of this macabre pilgrimage occurred months into the journey. The cortege, seeking shelter from a storm, stopped for the night at a convent. Only after the coffin had been placed in the chapel did Joanna realize it was a convent for nuns, a house full of women. A surge of the old, undiluted jealousy seized her. In the dead of night, screaming that even in death her husband should not be surrounded by females, she ordered the heavy coffin to be carried back outside into the howling storm. There, in the open countryside, with the wind screaming and torches guttering and spitting in the rain, she demanded the coffin be pried open once more so she could confirm no nun had come to comfort him. She sat beside the open casket, staring at the decomposing face of her beautiful Philip, until dawn. She was keeping a vigil not just against death, but against a world of imagined rivals, a final, desperate assertion of a wife's total possession. The members of her court, shivering and terrified, looked on this scene not as a testament of love, but as the ultimate proof of a mind dissolved into mania. Shortly after this feverish night, deep in the winter in a small village called Torquemada, Joanna's body, which had been straining under the weight of grief and pregnancy, finally gave way. She went into labor, and there, in a crude, cold dwelling, with her dead husband's coffin perhaps visible from her window, she gave birth to a daughter, Catalina. It was a birth shadowed by death, a life emerging from a funeral. After the birth, the wandering stopped. The coffin was finally placed in the charter house of Miraflores, awaiting a more permanent tomb. But for Joanna, there was no release. The political machine that required her to be mad was still grinding. Her father, Ferdinand, had now successfully maneuvered himself as regent. If Joanna's grief-stricken procession was a tool for her enemies, they wielded it with deadly efficiency. The story of the queen who rode at night with a rotting corpse was circulated across Europe, retold in every court as black comedy and horrific cautionary tale. It cemented the image that would define her for 500 years. Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. And as regent, her father needed her confined. He placed her in the royal palace of Tordesillas, a fortress convent overlooking the slow, gray waters of the Duero River. It was meant to be a temporary solution. It became a prison for 46 years. For nearly half a century, Joanna lived in those rooms, the rightful Queen of Castile, the first sovereign of a united Spain, a ruler who never ruled. The windows that looked out over the river became the walls of her world. She was kept in a state of enforced political infancy. Her jailers, appointed by her father and later by her son Charles, the Holy Roman Emperor, controlled her every visitor, read her mail, and systematically starved and abused her when she refused to behave as a grateful madwoman. They knew she was not without her lucid moments. In her writings, there is a sharp, tragic intelligence, a deep concern for the injustices of her confinement. She could speak of politics with clarity, yet she was denied mass, denied proper medical care, and kept in squalor when she was melancholic. Her jailers, particularly the Marquesses of Denia, treated her paranoia as a reason to withdraw all comfort, creating a self-fulfilling spiral of despair. She lived through the whole of her son's reign, the most powerful man in Europe, an emperor on whose dominions the sun never set, while the woman who had given him that power was forced to eat off the floor. The Comuneros, the Castilian rebels who rose up against Charles's foreign rule, stormed Tordesillas and declared her their true and rightful queen. For a single, shattering moment, she met them, listened to their pleas, and did not sign a paper condemning them. But her lifelong, tragic habit of refusing to act, her deep Catholic fear of causing bloodshed, reasserted itself. She would not be their revolutionary mascot. When the rebellion was crushed, the soldiers left, and the doors of her prison closed tighter than ever before. On Good Friday in April 1555, 75 years old, having outlived her husband by nearly 5 decades, her father, her mother's memory, and almost every human being who had ever known her as something other than a legend, Joanna of Castile finally died. She was laid to rest in the Royal Chapel of Granada, right next to Philip. In a final, sculpted irony, the man she chased through the night, through storms and jealousy and death, was at last, and forever, by her side. Her story was written by those who imprisoned her, a narrative of female hysteria that served the ambitions of father, husband, and son. But look again at her journey. Was it madness to refuse to be silent in grief, to refuse to accept the political burial of a husband who had tried to bury her reputation? Was it madness to hold onto her physical, fleshly claim to a man that God and state had taken away, to rage against the very concept of a world that continued to spin without him? The queen who traveled with her husband's coffin was not just a woman in love. She was a sovereign who, stripped of her throne and her voice, used the only language left to her, a language of excess, of darkness, of an almost holy grief, to scream her truth across the plains of Castile. She turned her body and his corpse into a final, wandering kingdom of two, a defiant, torchlit procession that told the world she would not go quietly into the prison they built for her.